Today on the Locked On Blues podcast, couple of big topics to cover. Number one, the St. Louis Blues got destroyed in their most recent preseason game, 7-0. So I'm going to be going over that. My initial reactions. Is it time to panic? Is it time to not worry because it's a preseason game? I don't know. Let's find out. Klim Kostin gets sent down on waivers. Will he ever play a game for the St. Louis Blues again? And finally, the final episode, or the final segment, what's the deal with Thomas Greiss? Should we be worried, or is it just a fluke because they were playing a couple men down against a full NHL roster? I'm talking about all that stuff and more on today's episode. Make sure you stay tuned.
You're Locked On Blues, your daily podcast on the St. Louis Blues. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Locked On Blues podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and your number one source for daily Blues content. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to remind you that it is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So everybody, thank you so much for joining today. It's a wonderful Friday. It is getting close to the end of preseason. The St. Louis Blues final preseason game is Saturday, October 8th. Not sure if this episode's going up Friday or Saturday, so it's either today or tomorrow, depending on when it goes up, when you're listening. But preseason is rapidly approaching its end, and that's probably for the best, as the St. Louis Blues got absolutely destroyed in their most recent game. So I'm going to be talking about that. But if this is your first time joining the show, welcome. My name is Josh Hyman. I've been hosting the show for a while. Thanks for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Only about 50% of you are subscribed that are watching this video based on stats. And we're getting close to 500 subscribers. Big milestone, big occasion. Looking forward to that. And close to 500 episodes. So a lot of good milestones coming up. If you're a returning listener, thank you. Thank you for making Locked On Blues your first listen. Appreciate you. All right, so let's just jump into it. Got a couple different topics today. First things first, let's just talk about the 7-0 beatdown that the Blues were handed in their most recent game. Obviously, at the start of the episode, I said, is it time to panic? And the answer is no. It's a preseason game. There really isn't a whole lot to take away from it. You know, you can't really look at the players and say, these guys are really concerning me, whatever. Jordan Kyrou was a late scratch. I don't think there's really too much to be concerned about there. But Ryan O'Reilly was literally the only player in the lineup, or the only forward in the lineup, that is going to be playing consistently for the St. Louis Blues this season. Robert Bortuzzo was out there on defense as well. So they had, at the end of the day, two NHL players. And, they were facing pretty much a full NHL roster that the Blue Jackets put out. So at the end of the day, it was always a game that they were going to lose. But, would I have liked them to lose 7-5 or 4-3? Yeah, that would be kind of nice. But at the end of the day, you can't really be too concerned about losing a preseason game 7-0, especially a preseason game where you're not playing any full-time NHLers, because there isn't really anyone you can look at and say, if they're played this way in the regular season, then we're screwed. The only guy that you can really point a finger at is Thomas Greiss. And I talked about this a lot on Twitter, and I'll get into this later in the episode. I don't think last night is a big concern for me in terms of Thomas Greiss, but I think it is a representation of who he is as a goalie, and he's just not going to be on every single night. And when he's off, he's very off. That's kind of a traditional backup goalie in the NHL. It's nothing about him, specifically. It's just kind of what you'd expect, especially when he has, pretty much an AHL defense in front of him playing against full NHLers, a full NHL squad, and a good squad at that in Columbus. So I'll get into that a little bit later. Overall, though, I think it's just a good indicator that the Blues are, not a perfect team. I don't think anyone thought they were going to be a perfect team. Every team in the NHL is going to get beat in preseason. Every team in the NHL is going to face big losses, 5-0, 7-0. I would not be surprised if the Blues lose something like 7-0 at some point in the regular season. That's just how the game of hockey works. Some nights it's just not your night. And that's what happened against Columbus. It just wasn't the Blues night, and that's understandable. Like I've said before, I don't want to repeat myself. They had one forward out there that's going to be on their full-time NHL roster, and one defenseman. And that one defenseman is going to be their third pairing defenseman, might not even play every single night. Ryan O'Reilly kind of had to do all the work himself in that instance, and he looked fine out there. I wasn't too concerned with him. He was a -2, which not great, but that's the middle of the road. There wasn't anyone on the team that wasn't a minus in terms of plus minus. Robert Bortuzzo being a -4 is a little bit concerning, but he did play close to the most minutes out of anyone on the team, and that's just not what Robert Bortuzzo is going to ever do. He's going to be playing probably about 10 minutes less per game than he played last night, so not something I'm super concerned about there. Overall, was it a little bit of a bummer to tune into the game looking for a fun time watching Blues hockey and watch them lose 7-0? Yeah, it's a bummer. I wish the game could have been more fun. But is this game an indicator that the Blues are going to have struggles in the regular season? No, not at all. Now, obviously, there is a little bit that goes into it. There are some aspects of the game that are going to have ripple effects, such as Klim Kostin and his struggles continuing and leading to him getting put on waivers. So I'm going to be talking about that in our second segment coming up. But before I get into that segment, I want to tell you guys about our good friends over at Bet Online. You know them, you love them, and they're here for you this hockey season. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football and hockey betting info this season. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, even golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts. And I'll be right back with the second half of today's episode. All right, so moving on from the 7-0 defeat, there are a few individual players that I want to talk about. And the first one is Klim Kostin. Now, I talked a lot about Klim Kostin in the previous few episodes, and that he was probably the biggest disappointment for me so far in this preseason. He's a guy that, at one point was a member of like the big three or the big four prospects for the St. Louis Blues. It was himself, Jordan Kyrou, and Robert Thomas were all looked at as being like the future of the St. Louis Blues. He was a first-round pick, obviously. I don't remember which year. I want to say like 2018-ish, something like that. Don't quote me on that. 2017, I don't know. He was a first-round pick a couple years back. Big frame, a lot of skill, but it just hadn't translated to the North American game yet. In that, by the North American game, I mean the AHL and the NHL. He's gotten limited stints with the St. Louis Blues, has struggled there, and the various AHL teams the Blues have gone through over the last few years, he's played there as well, and hasn't looked that great. He came into the league supposed to be sort of a big body skill player, kind of a grinder, but more so like a two-way player that has a lot of skill, can score the puck, can score goals, make good passes as well, sort of a well-rounded player. And he kind of, instead of that, turned into a full grinder. He had a ton of penalty minutes in the AHL last season, a lot of fights, and not a whole lot of points to show for it. He's had flashes with the Blues where he's looked like he's got some potential there, and I've talked about it in the past few episodes that I think he's sort of just a low motor player in the sense that he's not as engaged as frequently as some other players, and that can be a successful player mold if you have the skills to back it up. Like I talked about Vladimir Tarasenko not having that high of a motor, but the fact that he's a top 5 goal scorer in the league when he's hot, makes up for it. He can be a low motor player and still be on pace to score 40 goals last season like he was. And there are a couple other players, not just in hockey, but in all sports. Motor is a valuable attribute for any player to have in any sport. You hear guys get talked about all the time for their high motor, and it can help a lower skilled player as well. A guy like Nathan Walker, who is a mosquito out there. He's a pest. He's not the most skilled player, but there's a reason he had a hat trick, is because every time he's out there, he's playing 110%. He's skating super hard, and he's making up for what he lacks in skill with effort. And that is a perfect example of a lower skilled player being elevated to NHL caliber because of his motor. Klim Kostin's the opposite. When Klim Kostin is playing at his peak, he's arguably good enough to be an NHL player. When he's fully engaged and fully trying hard, I think he could be an NHL player, and I wouldn't be surprised to see maybe a team with much less depth than the St. Louis Blues give him a shot. Because of that, because you're getting a guy that's gonna 1 out of every 5 games he's gonna play some pretty good hockey, but the rest of the 4 games he's gonna disappear. And the St. Louis Blues just can't really afford a guy like that right now. Their lineup has so much depth to it that it wouldn't make sense to have such an inconsistent player in their lineup. And that's something that I was talking about in previous episodes, that he kind of just looks lazy and disengaged out there at times. And when you have 6 guys fighting for the last 3 forward spots, if you're disengaged and you're lazy, it doesn't matter how good you are at your peak, you're going to have a really hard time winning that spot. And sure enough, today news breaks that Klim Kostin is being sent down on waivers, and that means the Blues have all but given up on him. For those of you that don't know, him being put on waivers means that every other team in the NHL has a chance to just take him for free. They get the waiver list, they see Klim Kostin's on waivers, they can put it in a claim, and then boom, Klim Kostin is on their roster. So the Blues are essentially fully welcoming trading him for absolutely nothing. So they have all but given up on him. Is there a scenario where he clears waivers, goes down to the AHL, miraculously finds some effort, and plays a full season with the Blues next year, or comes up with an injury? Sure. That's possible. It's also possible that he clears waivers, spends time in the AHL, and then doesn't get re-signed by the Blues and goes to play somewhere else. Like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if he got claimed on waivers. He's young. He's a first-round pick. He still probably has some potential there that teams are willing to take a flyer on, especially teams that aren't as skilled, that can afford to just give a guy like Klim Kostin a roster spot. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him get claimed on waivers, but I think his era with the St. Louis Blues is all but over. Unfortunately, he's a player that I was really excited about when he was drafted. But at this point, I think he's been given ample opportunity to come in and prove himself with the St. Louis Blues. He had an opportunity last season, even the season prior. And now this season in preseason, he's had plenty of opportunities, and he just hasn't proven himself. And like I said, it's not just a matter of him breaking through at the NHL level. He's struggled at the AHL level too. Not quite as much. He's looked like a more complete player down there against the lesser competition, but even then, he hasn't really shown you a whole lot in the AHL that has shown improvement. And that's the other big thing with Klim Kostin, is I don't see him as much of a different player than he was when he was first drafted, or when he first was called up to the St. Louis Blues, his first preseason or his first training camp. That Klim Kostin that we saw a few years ago is pretty much identical to the Klim Kostin we see now. I don't really see an area where I'm like, oh, he's a better skater now, or he's more physical, or he's got a better IQ, or he's working harder. It really feels like he's kind of just plateaued as a player, and that's something that's frustrating out of a guy that the Blues thought had a ton of potential. Maybe he needs a change of scenery. Look at Tage Thompson. Tage Thompson was sort of in a similar vein. He didn't have quite as many opportunities, but the second that he goes to Buffalo, he turns his game around and earns himself a huge contract and looks like a great player. Could Klim Kostin have that same thing happen to him? Maybe. I don't know. It's just I don't think it's going to happen with the St. Louis Blues. Maybe in a couple years when they have more room for youth on their roster, if the timeline was a little shifted. But right now, I don't see a place for him on this roster this year, or probably even next year. But who knows? Things can change. But overall, I think the Klim Kostin era in St. Louis is all but over, unfortunately. And a lot of you guys were giving me crap when I said that he was my most disappointing player. A lot of you guys went, oh, he had a goal. He hasn't had opportunities, whatever. Well, Doug Armstrong agrees with me. He clearly listened to the podcast and said, yeah, you know what? This Josh guy is kind of smart. Klim Kostin hasn't been playing well. I'm going to put him on waivers. So there you go. Jokes aside, though, it's disappointing to see. Like I said, he was a player that I was really excited about, and it never really came to fruition. But hey, that's player development. You're not going to hit every single time. That being said, in this upcoming third and final segment, I'm going to talk about Thomas Greiss. And this isn't just about last game where he struggled. It's more just about him as a whole and what to expect out of him in the backup role, before kind of just giving my overall thoughts on preseason. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Be right back. All right. So one of the few full-time players that played for the St. Louis Blues in that 7-0 defeat was Thomas Greiss. Now, he gave up 7 goals last night. Or was it last night? Last night? October 6th? Yeah, today's the 7th. Last night. He gave up 7 goals on 31 shots, which is good for let's do some quick math, a 774 save percentage. That's really bad. Now, was he facing full NHL talent? Or full roster NHL talent with an AHL defense in front of him? Yes. So I'm not like saying, oh, last night it changes everything about Thomas Greiss. No, I think this just kind of reaffirms everything that I'd kind of been thinking about Thomas Greiss heading into this season, where he's a capable backup, but Blues fans have been spoiled where in the last few years our backups have been guys that can go on runs and become the starter if needed. Thomas Greiss just doesn't have that potential. He's looked decent in his other appearances in preseason, but like I said, 1 out of every few games he's going to struggle, and it's going to be different than a guy like Jordan Binnington struggling, where he maybe instead of 1 or 2 goals he gives up 3 or 4. When Thomas Greiss struggles, he can give up 7 goals. That is kind of what's expected of backup goalies in the NHL. Is when they're off, especially when they're not playing as much. So the way that I look at it, the less starts Thomas Greiss has, the better. He's gonna give you some good games. He's gonna win some games for you. He's gonna pitch some shutouts here and there. He's going to keep you in games. He's a fine backup. The Blues can absolutely win games when Thomas Greiss is in net. However, if it gets to the point where Jordan Binnington is struggling, or God forbid Jordan Binnington gets hurt and Thomas Greiss is starting like 4 or 5 games in a row, just like how goalies can win you games, they can steal you games, where you get outshot by 30, but the goalie stands on his head and gives you a chance to win. Goalies can lose you games as well. That's just a fact. And if Thomas Greiss is your starter for 5 consecutive games, one of those games he might just lose you. It's just unfortunately the truth. And that's nothing against him as a goalie. That's just expected of a goalie of his caliber. He's not starting quality goalie. So it puts a little bit more pressure on Jordan Binnington to be consistent and be, good for a full NHL season. And I think that's something that I've been echoing a lot throughout the offseason, is that this is a really big test year for Jordan Binnington, in the sense that he doesn't have a safety net anymore. He doesn't have a Ville Husso that can come in and take the starting reins and lead the Blues to the playoffs. If you're trusting Thomas Greiss to lead you to the playoffs, he is leading you to the draft lottery at that point. And I think Binnington is going to welcome the challenge. I think part of him is probably super excited to have, a true backup behind him, in the sense that he is the guy now. He is that goalie. And I'm sure he was a little bit bitter watching Ville Husso have success. He'd never admit it, and he wants the team to win more than anything. But he wished it was him out there when he was struggling and Ville Husso was coming in and winning games left and right. He wished that was him, and we saw that in the playoffs. Jordan Binnington came in and lit it up. He was rock solid out there, and I've said this before: the Blues might have beat the Colorado Avalanche if Binnington stays healthy. That's going to be one of the big what ifs of Blues history. But I think he's excited. I think he's welcomed the challenge. And last night, all it did was reaffirm that Thomas Greiss isn't going to come out and play stellar hockey every single time he's out there. He had been really, really good heading into last night's game. But that's just the inconsistencies of a backup goalie in the NHL, or goalies in the NHL in general. It's just the lows of Thomas Greiss are lower than the lows of Ville Husso or the lows of Jordan Binnington. Or if you go way back, the lows of Jake Allen, which I guess Jake Allen had some pretty low lows, but we don't need to get into that. People will get mad at me if I start trashing Jake Allen. But yeah, I mean, I think overall it's just an indication that Jordan Binnington needs to play great hockey this year. I've stood behind that. I'm confident that he's going to come in and play good hockey, because he knows that he has to. And when he's playing with confidence, when he's playing with swagger, he can be one of the best goalies on the planet. And I'm really excited to see that. That being said, the Blues only have 1 preseason game left. I'm so excited to watch them play regular season hockey. The regular season actually started today. There's a game going on right now in Europe, and nobody can watch it because it's like not on ESPN Plus or anything. So I haven't been able to watch it, but just seeing replays on Twitter and stuff is great. So hockey is officially back as of today, October 7th. Big news. I'm so excited for the regular season. The full regular season starts October 11th, and the Blues get 4 days after that before their first game. which is really annoying. So from today, October 7th, we have 8 short days until the Blues start regular season hockey. I'm so excited for that. I hope you guys are too. And if you want to hear all my reactions throughout the regular season to everything the St. Louis Blues do, make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button on whatever podcast platform you're listening to me on, because that is all the time I have for y'all today. So thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a good week of episodes with the preseason and all that stuff, ramping up the upload schedule, all that fun stuff. Look for close to 5 episodes next week if possible, plus a couple little short videos coming out about 5 things you need to know for the Blues season, over under win total. There's a lot of content coming your way, and the only way you'll be able to find that is, like I said, following or subscribing wherever you get your podcast. Plus, subscribe on YouTube. I said it at the top of the episode. But if you missed it, getting close to 500 subscribers, be a big milestone there. So please do that. If you're feeling generous, hit the notification bell. That way, whenever I upload an episode, you'll be the first to know. You can hop on. You can leave a comment. I try to interact with all the comments you guys leave. I love reading them. I love getting feedback and all that good stuff. Make sure you follow Locked On Blues on all of our various social accounts, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok at Locked On Blues. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh Hyman NHL. I wanted to thank you all so much for listening. And as always, let's go Blues.